welcome to A Moment in Time with Nex. We are testing out a new microphone today, so there's a lot of changes that I have to make, and it might not sound great, but I like that it's my first dynamic microphone, and I'll talk about it more another time. But if your brain is hungry, I hope this helps. We are talking about this book today, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. And I'm white, and I learned a lot about myself and a lot about racism as a whole from reading this book. This concept of being fragile because of being white was something I had never thought of before, but as I read the book, I thought, yeah, this is a good way to describe an experience that I've had. Even in reading this book and making this review about this book, as a white person, at least for me personally, sometimes I'm afraid to talk about race at all because I feel like it's gonna be racist. I'm gonna say something racist or inappropriate, or, even to acknowledge different races feels like it's potentially racist. So we try to just pretend like we don't see race. We pretend like it makes no difference. And for us as white people, it makes a difference, but it benefits us. So it's easy for us to act like racism or race is no big deal. And I have been really shocked at the number of people, all white, could be just coincidence since my spheres are mostly white as well. People that I talk to are mostly white, but a lot of people bringing things up like, well, and she talks about this in the book as well, there aren't slaves anymore. So therefore, because there are no slaves, there is no racism. And nobody's racist anymore because people don't blatantly express their feelings about different race. And by just pretending like it doesn't exist, we further it. So the type of racism that matters isn't some angry person yelling out obscenities. It's the system. It's systemic racism. It's the type of racism that is subtle and covert, the type that we don't see or notice as white people. But people of color, and feel free to speak up on this, I can't speak for you, likely do notice it, and it does affect them, and they're very aware that the system is built on racist principles, and their race automatically makes it harder for them to get access to resources, to get access to education, to get access to opportunities. And the other side of this is that as white people who generally have all of the power as a race, it's up to them to make changes. They would have to change things, and why would they change a system that benefits them? So it's kind of a tricky situation, not an easy one to solve, but an important one to talk about. A couple things that caused me to read this book were two things. One, I watched the show Big Brother, and there was a big element of race in both this past season and the season prior to this. So I'm recording this in December 2022. So the summer of 2022 and the summer of 2021, both seasons had a strong element of race in them. And during that same time that this past season was having their situation with racism, I was going on a few dates with a guy who was Black, and I was very caught off guard by, I think I went on 3 dates with this guy, and every date he not only brought up our races, but he also brought up the idea from the movie Get Out, where a white woman seduces a Black man, and then her family, her mom, spoiler alert, hypnotizes the Black guys into becoming slaves for their family. And he made jokes about me doing that to him. I mean, within the first 3 dates, and I'm pretty sure it was every single one. And I was just very uncomfortable by this. You can call it white fragility. It's a concept I wasn't familiar with at the time, but I didn't understand why it was such a thing for him. Why is he bringing this up so much? I don't care. Why does he care so much? And I even probably had the thought, like, he's racist. He thinks I'm going to enslave him because I'm white. But as I read this book, and as I tried to zoom out a little bit, what I realized was that he's just very aware of his own race in a way that I can't appreciate as a white person, because it doesn't have a negative impact on me. I'm not fetishized for being white. So I'm not aware of it. I don't care about it. I barely notice it because it doesn't matter to me. Whereas for him, he's more aware that he's maybe the only black guy in the whole restaurant that we're at. I don't know if he was or not. Like, I really wasn't paying attention to it in the way that maybe he was, and maybe he's used to it. I mean, he's lived here his whole life, and he's probably been around majority of white people, since in America that is the majority. But it was a perspective that I didn't really think about, was like, it's on his mind, he's aware of it, it feels like an elephant in the room for him, it's something that he wants to bring up and talk about, and it's not necessarily racist, it's more like maybe just wanting to be able to have the conversation and not act like it doesn't exist, which is a way that white people perpetuate the systemic racism, is, again, like I said, by not talking about it, pretending like it doesn't exist. So much so to the point where, to me, it barely does exist. Like, I don't feel like it's this big elephant in the room. I don't care about dating people of other races. It doesn't occur to me. My family has never told me that I couldn't, and even if they did, I wouldn't personally care. So I just don't like have a preference for one race over another per se, although I've dated mostly white people. Again, I'm around mostly white people, and this is kind of where we talk about privilege and how it's so easy when you live this privileged life to say to other people, well, just, take advantage of the resources. We all went to the same, schools, but we didn't. That's the problem, is that people of color are more likely to be born into poverty and more likely to be raised in schools where there's just less access to resources. Teachers are paid less, they bring in less money through tax revenue so they can afford less supplies for the school. There's probably less philanthropy going on in those communities, generally speaking. And there's a lot of data, there's a lot of studies in this book that talk about all these different things, including like affirmative action, and how the part of the population that benefited most from affirmative action is actually white women. And one of the chapters is actually all about the tiers of white women, and how a black woman that she was working with had said something about how if she has to comfort another white woman crying over some racist event, she's gonna lose it. It's like, it's healthy and good to feel empathy, but it's kind of like all about, are you really helping, or are you like taking? So there's a lot of examples in the book. She does a lot of like workshops where she talks about racism in the workplace, and white people time and time again will speak up and get very defensive and be like, well, I'm not racist and I don't understand, and they'll say some racist stuff. Or a person of color will speak up and say they feel like they've been, what's the word I'm looking for here? They've been at a disadvantage because of their race, basically. And this white person will get defensive and jump up and say, well, hey, no, that's not what happened. That's not the truth. And they kind of steal the attention and the spotlight from the problem. It's like, as a white person, it's really hard for us to have it's hard for anyone to have an objective perspective of racism, right? We're all humans. We're all part of the systems that we're raised in. I'm an American. I'm raised in America. This person who wrote the book works in America but isn't from here originally, and just talks a lot about the history of racism and in different ways that we perpetuate it. So one thing that I noticed with myself, who always was similar, right? Defensive. Oh, I'm not racist. And kind of like righteous about things. I noticed I was talking about a person, this was only maybe 2 months ago, and I referred to him as this big, tall, black guy. If he was white, I wouldn't have said he was a big, tall, white guy. I would have just said he's this big, tall guy. White is just assumed. And it's just like one of those little things. Like, I wasn't saying anything bad about this person. but, or, you know, especially not, I wasn't saying anything bad about him or based on race, but that's like all we think of as racism. But just the fact that I brought up his race as a defining characteristic, I defined him as other, different from me, you know, like, there's something about it, right? Because so many of us, people of color in America have mostly had to culturally appropriate towards like European ways of living, American ways of living, where a lot of us are very undereducated on anything about any cultures of people of color, because oftentimes we think if we explore them or ask questions that maybe that's racist. You know, it's like, it's just one of those things that it's easier for us not to talk about it. On the flip side of this, it's not up to any minority that you cross paths with, some person of color, to educate you on racism. It's not up to them to be the speaker on behalf of all people of color, and you just go up to them and start asking them questions about racism. You know, do your research, talk to people who want to have the conversation, and be open-minded. Don't be defensive. Don't jump in. Don't interrupt. Don't try to explain away anything. Just listen to different perspectives, be open-minded, and try to take that defensiveness down. I think that's probably the best way to have a positive impact on our own personal. It's like what Gandhi says, be the change you want to see in the world. Same thing here. Are we going to change systemic racism by reading this book? Maybe. I'm open to it. But first we have to kind of look at ourselves and see where we do this. Oh, another way I noticed, so right around this same time, maybe a week later after I noticed that I had defined a person by their race, I was having conversation with two white guys, and one of the guys was talking about one of their friends that I didn't know, and he described him as Asian. He said, oh yeah, our Asian friend, something, something. And it wasn't relevant to the story, just like the guy I was talking about being black wasn't relevant to my story about him either. And what I noticed here was, not only did I immediately notice it because I'm reading this book, and I had just had the realization of my own little like covert racism just a week before, but he said it, and then I perpetuated racism in this way by not correcting him, or not correcting him, but asking him, oh, why did you mention that? And bringing up the conversation and talking about, you know, looking inward at ourselves and figuring out, like, are we maybe at least a little racist in the sense that we don't really understand much about these other races? We pretend that race doesn't exist. That's not really helpful, to pretend like the problem doesn't exist, to pretend like most people living in poverty are people of color, to pretend like most people in the prison population are not people of color. That doesn't help people of color. Telling them you don't see their race, you don't care about the color of their skin, isn't really helpful. It has the right intention, I think, for a lot of people. It's like we think that's the right way to just treat everyone the same, but they're not being treated the same at a large scale systemic level, and that is an important thing to talk about. So I think that it's important to keep this conversation going. This is the first book I've read on the subject. I know virtually nothing, so feel free to comment if you have any questions that you want to add to this, or any comments that you have. And if you have any ideas for other books that you want me to read, or other topics you want me to talk about, I will be starting a podcast in the next month or so, and I hope that you guys will tell me what you want to hear me talk about, and we'll add that to the roster. I'm really excited to see what is coming up in the future. Thank you guys so much for listening to today's review on White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. If you liked this video, please subscribe, and I hope to see you on the next one. This has been A Moment in Time with Taylor. You are worthy of being loved and feeling comfortable in your own skin. Expri medium, squeeze the day. See you on the next one.